we're seeing different types of trouble these days, Jim. And you have been very much keeping an eye on not only the health of the U.S. government, but the ripple effects that a downgrade means. How do you explain how the rest of America might feel now that the health of the U.S. government is also compromised? Is that fair?
Well, I mean, the Moody's downgrade was sort of inevitable, given the state of the budget deficits that really have been going on now since 2000. For the last 25 years, the Congress has really failed to get its house in order, but it's getting worse now. And Moody's downgrade followed. S&P downgraded in 2011 during a big debt ceiling dispute between the Obama administration and the Republican House. Fitch followed in 23 for the same reasons that Moody's has cited. And Moody's kind of what took them so long because our fiscal stats are just all out of balance, right? We're running a deficit of $2.5 trillion now, and it threatens to widen, to become worse.
Right.
And our debt to GDP is now, the gross government debt is larger as a matter of stock than the actual the economy itself. So as the deficit is growing faster than the economy, and therefore deficit is growing faster than our tax revenues, and it's threatening to expand unless we have what economists call a fiscal consolidation plan, unless we raise revenues and reduce spending to close the deficit.
This is something I'm wondering about today. In 2017, when Trump initially passed the TCJA, everybody on the left and a lot of people in the center said, this is just a tax cut for the rich, and criticized it. Now, Democrats seem to be saying we need to extend this. Like, why don't we just kill the TCJA or let it good night this year?
Well, the talking point is it would be the largest tax increase in American history, right? Because if it isn't extended, then all of the rates go back to where they were in 2016.
That's a talking point, but I mean, what does it mean for each individual, right?
There's truth to it. The tax cut was across the board. Obviously, if you're paying more in taxes, you've got a bigger dollar benefit from the tax reductions. But today, we definitely have to raise taxes. And the problem that the deficit hawks on the Republican side of the aisle, the guys who held the bill up last night, but apparently have now found some reason to support it and let it get to the floor, the problem the deficit hawks have on the Republican side is they have one hand tied behind their back. The only thing they can do is cut spending, because they've all taken like a religious pledge never to raise taxes.
But to be clear, this one big, beautiful bill is going to add $3.3 trillion to the deficit if everything is temporary, is kept temporary. And if they extend things permanently, it's going to add $5.2 trillion to the deficit.
But it's worse.
Right.
Because just imagine, these projections are all made on a 10-year basis.
Yeah.
And they assume, consistent economic growth. So just imagine the Trump tariffs, because of the uncertainty and the variability, and is it 145% yesterday or 40% today on China? Imagine we have a recession. In the last 5 or 6 recessions, the budget deficit actually blows out because tax revenues go down and spending increases, so-called automatic stabilizers. So what today is 6.4% of GDP as a deficit, $2.4 trillion deficit, could easily expand to $4 trillion if we had a recession. So they are risking a fiscal disaster.
At which point we'll be at 125% debt to GDP, or 130% debt to GDP.
The debt to GDP comparison really isn't the most important one, right? We could sustain the level of debt we have if we can bring our deficits down and therefore get our interest rates down. The real problem, as you were talking to Zelen earlier, the real problem, as with a company, the country has, is the interest burden. So today, the interest burden on the federal government is consuming 18% of our revenues. Our total revenues 18% of them are going to pay interest. That's going to be the largest spending category on the federal budget in a year.
Over $1 trillion a year.
Bigger than Social Security, bigger than Medicare.
Bigger than the military.
Bigger than the military. It is, and it's growing as the deficits grow.
The amazing thing to me, too, and to be fair, we've seen the deficit grow under Republican administrations and Democratic ones. This has been a slow bleed for many years.
A fast bleed.
A fast
for many years.
Yes,
yeah.
We just keep bleeding out. Now, if we look at the tax bill, you were making this point earlier that if you don't raise taxes, you just have to cut spending. And these Medicaid cuts, for example, what does this look like going into the midterms, ultimately?
So let's talk about the things that the reconciliation bills on both sides of the House, on both sides of the Congress, are focusing on cutting, are basically programs where the federal government transfers money to the states. Education, transportation, healthcare. These are not direct transfers by the federal government to individuals, but transfers by the federal government to states who then administer the programs. So these cuts that they're talking about are going to cause fiscal problems at every one of the states. The average state in the United States gets 35% of its revenues, its total revenues, from the federal government. So when you cut Medicaid, you're forcing the states either to cut the program back or to raise their own taxes to pay the same level of benefits they're currently paying out, to put more state money into the programs. You might argue that's the right thing from a federalism point of view, but the result of these spending cuts at the federal level are going to create real fiscal pressures at each of the states. And this is one of the reasons, I think some of us are skeptical they can actually get this done, is it's worse for the red states than the blue states. The red states actually depend more on the federal government's
They are wagon riders, not wagon pullers.
They depend more on the federal government's largesse than the blue states do. So the Republicans have a very narrow majority in the House. And, these spending cuts are going to really hit all the states, but the red states particularly hard. Even look at what the cuts to the Inflation Reduction Act's various tax credit programs for renewable energy, EVs, battery plants. The Biden administration thought they could protect those programs by targeting the investments in battery plants and in chip plants in red states. So when these subsidies that are proposed to be cut hit the House floor, you're going to see a bunch of red state Republicans going, oh, wait, not so fast.
Wait, so I want to go back to something you were saying earlier, that you look at the cost of borrowing for the U.S. government, and then you add a multiplier effect on top of that for the rest of the country, for corporations.
Right.
You made this point once to me before, that you cannot be rated domiciled in the U.S. at a rating above the U.S. government. This is part of the problem, right?
Well, no governmental unit can be rated higher than the federal government. So, the states and the municipalities who issue tax-exempt debt, this is all going to have impacts on them, because at the end of the day, their sovereignty depends, largely on the sovereignty of the United States.
It's a stone rolling down the mountain.
But for corporates, sure, there's always a spread to the 10-year Treasury. So if the 10-year Treasury is, as it is the yield is slowly moving up, not really because of the Moody's downgrade, but really because of the imbalance in the federal government's finances and the huge amount of deficits they have to finance. And because the Yellen Treasury Department and now Scott Bessent's Treasury Department is funding short rather than long, you have huge refinancing obligations as that short-term debt has to be refinanced. So this year, in the next 12 months, Bessent is going to have to refinance $8 trillion worth of the federal debt and finance a $2.5 trillion budget deficit. That's a huge supply of treasuries coming into the market. So one expects that, that the risk premia that investors are going to impose on the purchase of treasuries is going to go up because of just how out of balance we already are, and what this new tax bill, reconciliation bill, may do to future deficits.